It's just a jump to the left.
It began as a stage play in the 1970s. Now, the 70s were an interesting time period when it came to musicals. We were in between the traditional style musicals and the more modern rock operas. And so after Hello Dolly and before Hello Kitty Kitty, we got ourselves a time-warping, sweet transvestite over at Frankenstein's Place. It all began in England when a young Richard O'Brien started working on the play in between acting gigs. He saw it as a mixture between the traditional, like beach films, old 50s horror films, and the more modern, like glam rock. This can best be seen in the characters of Brad and Janet versus the character of Frankenfurter. In a way, it was a peek into the future where gender politics has become a hot topic. I mean, there wasn't an internet, so no mad Twitter tirades, but at least the discussion about identity through sexuality got started. Granted, there was a lot more emphasis on lingerie and sex than today, but you get the picture. The plot was virtually the same on both theater and film, with the minor tweak here and there. Both Richard O'Brien and Tim Curry starred in the English production as well, but there was one big difference between the film and the play. It was a play. It's hard to describe the differences between the two formats. Plays are live and films aren't. At least not yet. I think the best way to know the difference is to go to the theater at least once, and if you can, see the theatrical version of a current film. I know it sounds weird, but theater is the least realistic of the two. The staging, the lighting, the acting, transfer the same elements into a film verbatim, and you get something that just doesn't feel real. Now that I got you really screwed up, okay, let's get back on track here. The play was a smash hit and led to the inevitable Broadway production. Now there, it didn't go over very well. Remember what I said about the traditional versus the modern? It was exactly like that. But it wasn't over yet. The LA production did much better. If you just look at the two environments, LA, New York, you can tell why. Interesting side note, Steve Martin auditioned for the part of Brad. Yeah, I have a hard time picturing that as well. So a future cult phenomenon on its way to future success. Well, not so much. We'll go into this more in the review portion of the film, but to boil it down, Hollywood saw this in terms of cash, not art. It was like they filmed the play and put it up on the screen. Yeah, it bombed. But before we get into the review, let's look at the reason such a property even made it to the screen in the first place. I saw this movie quite a bit when I was in high school. This should give you an idea about how long this has been going on, as well as my age, but we're not talking about that here. Once again, let me remind you about traditional versus modern. Say with me, everybody, traditional versus modern. Film culture may have exemplified this more than any other medium at the time. What we got was essentially a time when what we would call independent films today were the norm at the studio level. Films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Dog Day Afternoon, Day of the Locust, Taxi Driver, the list goes on. It was the age of the auteur. Experimentation was the word of the day. The director was in charge. And that's what the Rocky Horror Show, now known as the Rocky Horror Picture Show, was. And it seemed like the perfect fit. Except it wasn't. Audiences stayed away. And it wasn't like the studio didn't give it a fair shot. They rolled it out on a red carpet. The audience just wasn't taking the bait. You'd think there was a reason for this reaction. There was. The presentation was little more than a film version of a stage play. Remember what I talked about back then about film and theater? That's never been very popular. In fact, this seems to be a problem with most works that are translated from theater to film. There was a term a few years ago how films like this had to be opened up. This meant usually adding new scenes that took place away from the central setting in order to make it feel less claustrophobic. And that usually didn't tend to work well either because they always seemed superfluous to the main action of the play, which they were. This also muted some of the more progressive, wild attitudes in the film. It came across as a silly mishmash of sexual politics and low-rent, late-night TV horror movie stuff, Granted, this is what O'Brien was going for when he wrote it, but in the theater, this like a wild celebration. In the film, it was just cheese. And all this made the whole thing less palatable for general audiences. The mixture of cheese and the wild sexuality part. Oh, like I said, audiences were more serious-minded in those days, but this whole thing, it was a musical, and it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. It was supposed to be fun. Just because it was about homosexuality and sexuality in general. I mean, it had men running around in lingerie singing songs. And sure, audiences have always had a soft spot for men in drag, but men in lingerie, well, not so much. Finally, this was a period when musicals were on the way out. Singing in the Rain, Oklahoma, these were now seen as quaint. Now, Rocky Horror wasn't quaint, but it was a musical. And people who were into musicals, they didn't like musicals like Rocky Horror. So, in other words, it wasn't fish and it wasn't fowl. So, it wasn't appealing to anyone. At least not yet. But before we get into all that, let's take a closer look at the film itself. Sure, it may not have translated well, but was it a good film? I'm handing this one over to my good friend at TYTD Reviews. He has some great reviews over at his channel. So after listening to this one, check out some others.
To many, 1975's The Rocky Horror Picture Show is the de facto cult movie. And I think certainly for a time they would have been absolutely right in that assertion. This movie screamed counterculture from the top of its lungs. It was colourful, violent, and deeply aroused. And it wanted you to know about its urges, whether you liked it or not. To this day, it remains one of the longest-playing movies in the entire history of cinema, to the point that it still hasn't finished screening to this day. That's right. If you were to scour the worldwide cinema listings right now, there'd be a screening of the Rocky Horror Picture Show going on out there somewhere. That should give you some indication as to exactly how powerful this movie's effect has been on people and how popular amongst its fans it really is. The writer, Richard O'Brien, has a quite limited bibliography. Aside from this, the only other films he's ever worked on were this movie's equal, Shock Treatment, and a TV movie called Digital Dreams. He's contributed material to a couple of stage plays and has been involved in most of the official productions of Rocky since the original theatrical run ended in 1980, but other than a few acting gigs on TV shows like The Crystal Maze, that's pretty much it. That being said, if you're pulling in Rocky royalties, I think you can afford to enjoy the finer things in life for a touch. Both film and play were directed by Jim Sharman. He has 6 directing credits to his name. Rocky and Shock Treatment are probably his best known, though he also has a credit for having directed Night of the Prowler. Much like O'Brien, I'm not surprised by his lack of work over the last few years in film and television, because when you're pulling in royalties like this, why bother? The film was shot through most of autumn and winter 1974 and received its premiere in 1975 to a rather large audience. Unfortunately, after its premiere, paying customers seemingly dried up rather quickly. You have to imagine it was 1975. The themes of sexuality, violence, and over-the-top glam camp were rather distasteful, both to American and UK audiences, who were still made up predominantly of Puritan Christian heterosexuals who believed that certain types of records were going to destroy the minds of the youth, or that martial arts films would inadvertently signal the start of the real-world version of Mad Max. But at least the film was available and out there. It just needed to find its audience. Fox, as the distributor, stepped in, recutting the film and repackaging it as a double feature alongside Brian De Palma's camp classic, The Phantom of the Paradise. What a double header that must have been. That would have been a bloody great night. Anyway, unfortunately, audiences at the time disagreed, and the floundering continued. Eventually, having lost almost all faith in the film, Fox dumped it off into the midnight screening circuit. This was a place where all the strange and misfit movies would ultimately end up. You'd get grindhouse films, the likes of which Vinegar Syndrome and Something Weird Video now fawn over. You'd have art movies like Warhol's films or John Waters' Pink Flamingos, and you'd inescapably get porn. It was kind of the Wild West of cinema, really. Anything went, and you never truly knew what you were letting yourself in for. The UK really rather missed out on these. I'd have loved this type of cinema had they done it over here. And it was here where Rocky ultimately found its audience. It played alongside controversial and sleazy movies, and eventually people hooked on to its tone, style and vibe. Whereas at one time cinemas were offering to let people in for free to watch the film as long as they turned up in costume, now they were practically turning people away. It was that popular. It became iconic. It established a look and feel and tone that previously hadn't really been explored outside of very serious experimental cinema. It's an experience to see this film in the cinema. I should know. I have done. There's a vibe in the room that you just don't get with any other film that I've seen before or since. It's a mixture of positive energy and openness. You can turn up dressed in 50 layers of clothes, you can turn up wearing a napkin, and everyone's totally cool about it. If you want to get up and dance to some of your favourite songs in the film, go for it. Odds are you'll get half of the theatre up with you. From my experience, when the time warp came on, the theatre stormed the screen and a full-blown Mad Hatter's tea party broke out for about 20 to 30 minutes before settling down when everybody realised that the movie was still actually playing. Arguably, it's the most fun I've had at a screening of a film in any cinema that I've been to. But what makes it so great anyway? Well, Sharman's direction is superb. Absolutely superb. The guy's a natural. The film's influences visually are B-movie creature features and horrors from the 1940s through to the 1960s. This, combined with O'Brien's absolute love of the then recently birthed glam rock scene, created a fantastic visual feast, and Sharman's direction throughout makes sure to take advantage of every single facet of that style and feel. It oozes personality. I haven't seen a film this eager to instill its vibe on an audience since Listomania, and I mean that as a very sincere compliment. This is an absolutely gorgeous film. Especially on its Blu-ray release, you really get to see all the gorgeous choreography, pans, subtle tracks, and composition in its best and fullest intentions. It's divine. Matching the fabulous direction, the acting throughout is absolutely superb too. Tim Curry is Dr. Frankenfurter. I have yet to see someone so fully embrace a character in such a way as he does here. They're inseparable in my mind. Every second he's on screen is an absolute delight, as he genuinely gives a performance unlike anything you're likely to see on the big or small screen ever again. Susan Sarandon, too, is an absolute delight as the panicked and tremendously uneasy bride-to-be Janet Weiss. Again, she totally embraces her role, and it's great to see her subtle movements in this. Just little twitches, flashes of expressions that come over her face and melt away just as quickly. She's a natural, and arguably one of my favourite characters in this. I mean, every performance is either panicked and at a complete loss to fully understand what's happening, or a coke-binged extravagance that reeks of self-aware libido-drenched lustings. Again, for 1975, for a film to do this and not be a porno was almost revolutionary for the time. Equally, I can't let this film go without mentioning the absolutely stunning set designs. There's a wide variety of styles, choices and influences prominent in this film's set designs. From the perfectly pink, clinical and curved set of Frankenfurter's laboratory, to the gothic vibes of the dining room and hallways, to the utterly thrown togetherness of the main ballroom. This film pinches a bit of everything, and it looks damn fine in doing so. In particular, the scenes in the theatre are gorgeous, with rich reds and blacks contrasting with the clear blueness of the pool. This is a very pretty film, and it's clear to see a real attention to detail in even the smallest things on set. From the glasses worn by Frankenfurter's guests to the random water coolers dotted around, because dehydration is the enemy, everything is there for a reason, and that reason is because it looks damn good being there. Do I even need to tell you how good the soundtrack is? It's campy, upbeat, 50s-inspired rock and roll and Carpenter's-esque string arrangements. There's not one poor number in the whole damn film, and any one of these tracks would instantly make any musical about 10 times better. The Time Warp, Damn It Janet, Touch Me, Hot Patootie are all wonderfully upbeat, rocky poppy numbers that will have your foot tapping and you up and out of your seat in no time. Personally, I'm most attracted to the song I'm Going Home, which I'm not ashamed to say brought genuine tears to my eyes when I saw this in the cinema screening. It's a powerful ballad about the reward of knowing that any bad times or troubles you might have had are almost over, and that the good times are just around the corner. Curry absolutely pours himself into this, and it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I wholeheartedly recommend that you watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't know if you'll like it, but I'd be willing to put good money on it that you'd have a positive reaction to it in one way or another. It's light-hearted, campy cinema at its finest, and it really is an experience to watch. Seriously, if you ever see it playing at your local multiplex, for God's sake, go. While I can't personally vouch for the theatre production, I can say that the film was a treat to see. And with simply fantastic direction, cine, scoring, acting, set designs and pacing, I'm sure you'll find something to love about it too.
Thanks for the review, TYTD. Pretty good. And as you may have noticed, he peppered in a few experiences with the film. It's pretty standard for modern critics of Rocky Horror because, well, it's a big part of the experience. And this leads into transformation into a cult. Remember, up until this point, there wasn't anything like this kind of experience with a movie. Of course, you had hecklers. This movie sucks! I didn't say it was clever, heckling, but the entire thing was organic, which probably doesn't come to much surprise for people. It can't create a cult movie, as many of you know. There have been attempts, but they didn't take. It first began at the Waverly Theater in New York. About 5 months into the run, during the sequence where Janet was wandering through the woods, her head covered with a newspaper against the rain, Louis Maurice Jr. uttered the first piece of what would soon be termed counterpoint dialogue. Buy an umbrella, you cheap bitch! Well, we all have to start somewhere. He was soon joined by others who were simply attempting to keep themselves entertained. I'm sure alcohol and other substances had nothing to do with it. Others began to join in, and soon you have a legion of comments flooding the screen. In fact, it soon became its own show. This spread to Los Angeles and San Francisco, to name a few venues. Each arena contributed its own elements to the stew. San Francisco, for example, was the first to do full performances of the film rather than just selected portions like the others. These were called performance groups. They were assigned roles, each of them emulating a character from the film, as well as their blocking. Think 3D without the glasses. At first, the counterpoint dialogue was scripted, and improving was actively discouraged. But this changed along with the venues. I myself added a line or two in my time. Don't ask me what they were. I can't remember. One can't look at this cult aspect of the film without mentioning Sal Piro, who regimented the first performances as well as forming the first and still only official Rocky Horror fan club. He can be seen in the beginning of Rocky Horror as the man on the phone, but also he's in the film Fame from 1980, where he plays himself at a Rocky Horror screening. Soon the national fan club merged with the international one, and the cult continued to spread over the world like... Some have even labeled it a religious experience. The Church of Frank. Bigger than Scientology? We'll never know. The Rocky Horror Picture Show experience has survived not only the passage of time, but home video release, usually signaling the end of a theatrical run, numerous stage revivals, and even a horribly mediocre remake performed on live TV by Fox. Oh, and there's also the Glee episode that features a watered-down version of various songs.
Madness takes its toll.
There's also, of course, the references in numerous other films and TV shows over the years. Even if the film has become part of the mainstream, it still remained faithful to its cult origins. Synergy. So what has been the impact of the cult on the film itself? Has it been able to retain the original meaning, or given way to the show rather than the message? Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Is this a movie with a story to tell or a theme that it wants to express? Or is it just all about the spectacle? To be honest, I can only look at it as I experienced it. It was a spectacle. I most likely wouldn't have heard of it when I was in high school if it was Rocky Horror as opposed to Rocky Horror. For me, it was all about the party. Going into a theater with a bunch of friends, acting free and not having to care what people think. Believe me, it was heaven for us drama geeks. And this takes us right back to the origins as a play. Remember, it started as a play and initial larger success as one. It wasn't until it returned to that type of presentation, artificially inseminated by the audience, to turn a phrase, that it became the success that it is today. I don't think it ever was about the message or the story because, well, to be honest, there's nothing really special or unique about it in that regard. What is special about the way is that how it makes people feel. The freedom of expression it gives to those who aren't in the norm. Which I suppose you could say is kind of the message, so I guess the two go hand in hand.
I have a lot of praise to give to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. From a technical and emotional level, this film is astounding, though sadly of late I've found myself somewhat growing a bit colder towards it. I can't entirely put my finger on exactly why it just hasn't been doing it for me over the last couple of years. I can see it's a damn fine film, and from the age of 12 up until a couple of years ago, I'd have had it in my top 10 films of all time, no worries. Thinking about it, I can only think of two things that could have had an effect. One is that, at the time, this film was seen as transgressive. It deals with themes like transvesticism, homosexuality, bisexuality, open relationships, and experimentation, which for a 70s mainstream audience would have been completely against their moral compasses, barring the film's supporters, of course. Today, while there are still corners of the world that do persecute homosexuality and transvesticism and the likes, it's much more accepted and much more prominent in films and media in general. As a result, what was at one time a somewhat catty and scathing attack on the rigidity of heterosexual lifestyles has been somewhat defanged. I mean, that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. I'd rather my love of a cult film be diminished because people of a particular sexual orientation are more accepted than keep the persecution going just to keep the film relevant, but I kind of feel like the film has served its purpose in that sense. I mean, I'm not just pulling that out of my backside either. As the recent revival of the Rocky Horror Picture Show illustrated, being gay or trans or bisexual really isn't as big a deal as it was 40 years ago. Meaning a film that boomed on that controversy is somewhat more prone to losing its impact than a film that didn't deal with those topics to begin with. I don't know what young teens would make of Rocky these days, but I don't think they'd be as wowed as mine or previous generations were. Also not helping matters is the fact that this film's been commercialised out the wazoo by this point. There are pop vinyls, t-shirts, bags, you name it, they've probably stuck something Rocky-inspired on it. Which kind of cheapens the experience for me somewhat. But that's the nature of movie making these days. Milk a film for every last drop, then dump it off for 10 to 15 years and hope it'll get a second life from nostalgia nerds. Like me. Then the cycle can begin again. Sad, but unfortunately the case. Thank you for having me on your channel. It was a pleasure. I hope I passed the audition.